Hello, today is Wednesday, June 15th or June 5th, 2019. This is the standard kubeadm office hours. As always, we have a standard code of conduct policy, which is basically boils down to don't be a jerk. We have a agenda packed with CIS benchmark stuff, but I will get the appropriate meeting notes shared here. Hopefully folks can see my screen.
Yes.
All right. So, all right. Do we want to go through it?
Yes, I don't see Nadir in the meeting. Here, he just joined. Okay. So basically, Nadir, do you want to walk us through basically the summary you created at the Discuss website?
Yeah, sure. Just give me a second. I just had some technical issues. Right, yes. So just come out of stuff we've been doing with people who are trying to use Kubernetes, I guess. What I've done here is went through CIS benchmarks for Kubernetes and Docker against clusters that are essentially brought up with kubeadm. And what we're finding is lots of false positives around the way that a lot of the tooling that's been built around CIS benchmarks is organized around repping for settings in configuration files, and often they're checking flags when we've moved to component config for kubelet, etc. And then additionally, there's some improvements we could make. And finally, there's things where you apply, say, pod security policies, and if you want a properly secure cluster, if you want a cluster that is properly conformant to these CIS benchmarks, we need to be able to modify the static pod definition. So how do we do that? So for each of these issues, I've given some suggestions that might work or might not work, but they're just ideas. I'm basically just open to doing that. So I'm just opening up the document. Hold on.
So do you want us to go one item at a time? I basically,
yeah.
I have comments for everything. Probably other people have comments as well for the hard problems.
Yeah.
You should probably basically explain each problem at a time, and we can have basically collect some opinions from the people present.
Yeah, sure. So I think this first one I probably need to edit. So this is actually not controller manager and scheduler. API server side, there's a recommendation to turn anonymous or false, but this breaks the readiness of liveness check. So it's quite an old issue that we've had. There was a suggestion, I think, from Justin to add a unauthenticated health endpoint that could be used regardless of whether or not unauthentic request is on. But additionally, it's not actually that big a security risk because we do actually check authorization regardless, apart from the health and metrics endpoint. So the question whether or not this control is correct in itself or adding an additional endpoint.
So this, I just want to read through this just for my own. You have a lot of context, and I'm missing some of the context, so I might have to level set. So I'm just reading the 111 disable anonymous authentication requires anonymous auth equals false to be set for controller manager and scheduler.
Sorry, that's API server, I think. Sorry, so it's my mistake. But yeah.
This does not currently work with kubeadm latest static manifests with HTTP readiness and liveness checks. With anonymous authentication disabled, these readiness and liveness checks do not pass subject access review and fail. So my first question is, requires anonymous auth equals false? Because we don't even recommend that ever.
Okay.
A lot of the detail is in the linked issue. We have a comment from Jordan there, where he explains that it's perfectly safe to have anonymous auth set to true, which, by the way, is already the default value. And Jordan is a representative of seek out in Kubernetes.
And is a co-author of this benchmark. Yeah.
Yeah, so he's been getting involved in discussions on the benchmark. I'm just going to try and look at the two. Actually, a little bit of background here. CIS is a kind of community project. So if anybody does want to, jump in and get involved in the discussion, you just simply have to sign up and join on the kind of workbench.cissecurity.org site. So, it's absolutely up for debate and discussion. The latest version, so I'm looking at the latest draft, and I've just moved off the page, but the latest draft does have the test still saying that, you should ensure that anonymous auth argument is set to false. But there is a rationale paragraph that says if you're using RBAC authorization, it's generally considered reasonable to allow anonymous access to the API server for health checks and discovery purposes. And hence this recommendation is not scored. So I think this has changed in the latest draft. We've moved it from scored to not scored, so it becomes more advisory than a requirement.
Yes.
Yeah, that will probably work, I think. Yeah.
Yes, so to my understanding, it's currently very high risk in the benchmark that Nadir had a look at. So, reducing the risk of this particular item is a potential solution here.
Okay. Is there a time frame for the update for the benchmark?
I'm trying to find if we have a deadline. They are quite how to say this? They're not the speediest things to get out. I think we are. I'm trying to find the. I think we're trying to get this for 1.15. Complicating it is the fact that we want to try and have this. There is another issue with the CIS spec, which is that for certain hosted, managed environments, the vendors are looking to have kind of have exceptions or to have some different versions. OpenShift being a really good example where actually their configurations are really quite different from ours. CIS is working with the vendors to start trying to do the kind of vendor-specific versions, but before we do that, we want to get all the vendors to do, there's going to be a kind of branching point when that happens, and we want to try and make sure that everything that can be put into the common version of the spec, the upstream spec, does happen before this branching thing happens, because otherwise it's going to be a complete nightmare. So I would like to say that this is going to come out in the next couple of months, but I think that might be a bit optimistic.
Maybe we should move to the next item. Thank you for the explanation, Liz.
Yeah, right. Thanks for that, Liz. So the second one is checking file permissions of the etcd directory. So for kubeadm deploys, which we're trying to get everyone to adopt, we're using static pod manifest for etcd. So it's a host path volume mount. etcd currently runs as root anyway within the pods. So there's not a possibility to specify an etcd user or group because we're not installing etcd on the host. So I'm not sure what to do about that one, really.
I would say the best thing is raise a ticket in the CIS workbench, because it might be completely reasonable to change that to say it has to be owned by etcd or owned by root. I'm pretty sure some of the other files and directories are marked as requiring to be owned by root. So, you know, I don't want to say definitely, but I think that would be a reasonable thing to suggest.
Cool, thanks.
Tim, what do you think about this user group situation for etcd?
Because we don't actually install a service and run it as a service as etcd, it seems a little weird because the whole kubelet itself is running as root, right? It kind of needs to. So or it could be run as Kubernetes. So I think updating the CIS benchmark to allow for multiple conditions, because this is predicated on the notion that like you have basically set up your deployment in a very specific way.
Related, there is a ticket open to talk about moving etcd out into its own section, because not all deployments even, you know, have etcd installed on a master node.
Yeah, that also sounds good. But generally, I think just putting this to root or allowing root here it should be good too. Like if you have root, you're pretty blocked anyway.
Yeah. That seems reasonable. So as an action item, who wants to follow up with filing these issues with the org, and where do we file them, I guess is the question.
So I've just posted in the chat a link to where you can sign up.
Yeah, I can file those issues.
Okay. All right, cool. All right, next up, use of host network namespace.
Yeah, so I think some of the tests, I think, so I was mainly using the DevSecOps inspect one, so checking use of host network namespace. We do that by design for kubeadm deploys because we're using static pods. So again, this is like where kubeadm specifically uses Kubernetes itself to deploy the control plane components. So they will necessarily use the host network namespace. So we need to either have some sort of way to exclude these or not do them or something. I'm not sure.
If it's not a control plane node, I mean, if it's not a control plane node, I generally agree. But there are user stories or scenarios where, you know, a user might want to do that, and it's actually it's a security risk for sure. But I don't know, how are we treating the CIS benchmark? Are we treating it as like a canonical source of security concerns, or like a advisory?
I think it's more how users do, and specifically security teams within organizations where Kubernetes is being used. So they tend to see it as gospel and and often these security teams don't have a massive amount of Kubernetes specific knowledge. So like arguing, you then have to make a case like, why is this red?
Yeah, this specific one is very is the deployment of how we deploy things for kubeadm. So I don't think we could not do this, or would even want to not do
I think the spec does give a little bit of leeway here. So I'm looking at the latest draft, so I'm not sure if this is what's in the current release version, but it says do not generally permit containers to be run with the host network flag set to true. And it's basically talking about using pod security policies to disallow containers from sharing the host network namespace. It says if you have need to run containers which require host network, this should be defined in a separate PSP. So that there is some scope there for either defining those PSPs and deploying that way. I think, you know, it might, if that seems too if setting up the PSPs to allow that is too kind of onerous, or there's obviously the issue of as soon as you turn on PSPs, you may render it difficult to actually get anything to run at all. So it might be worth some discussion, but it does have that word "do not generally permit containers to be run with host networks." So there is a little bit of leeway.
I think has anyone looked into crafting? No, I'd have to double check my understanding here. If you could even do it, of having a pod security policy for static manifests.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I had a quick look of how to enable PSP in kubeadm, and actually the UX around that is not that easy, because currently we have the node restriction admission controller, and it is conflicting with the pod security policy admission controller. So we have to first start the API server with a node restriction admission controller and modify the manifest to enable the pod security policy admission controller. But before that, we have to add the policies themselves. And then this, after we modify with the new admission controller, this is going to restart. So we basically need a restart for the API server. And I also did not try to get a clear definition of what policies we're going to add.
That's a bunch of extra complexity I don't think makes a ton of sense for a control plane node.
It's conflicting. Sorry.
It's a bit, you can do it, and we do it. We do. So the interesting thing that you have is the pod security policies do not get applied to the static pods. Static pods continue to run regardless. What happens is the mirror pods don't appear in the API server until you have a pod security policy that lets them through. So it's a terrible UX, but it is possible right now, and we do that. That's how we do it.
Another approach that might be worth discussing might be modifying the rule in the spec just to have it explicitly carve out particular namespaces, like Kubernetes system namespace.
That would make a ton of sense to me, because there are conditions where self-hosted. This is like one of the ways to do self-hosting with kubeadm, that you would definitely want or need host networking enabled. I like that idea. Does someone want to take an action item to follow up on that? I think crafting a pod security policy is really weird for this user story, because the control plane nodes are already tainted too as well. So the idea of getting outside access for things landing on it would be slightly odd.
I think this falls in between the balance of the minimal viable cluster and a cluster that the users want to make an extra step more secure. So we follow the logic of minimal viable cluster in kubeadm. So we basically need to evaluate if this minimal viable cluster is insecure with the aspect of the host network for containers.
I don't know. I can see your point, but I'm also like, this is a control plane node. It needs to be treated special. Unless you actually have it crafted. If you're running these via systemd units, you don't have this problem, right? But that's different. It's a different deployment model than what we've chosen for kubeadm because of
you basically have to apply the PSPs if you're running static pods. There's no way around it. Otherwise, you'd never see, like, control plane carries on running, but you never see them. So you must apply a pod security policy that applies to the kube system namespace. So that's going to happen regardless. I don't think we need to enforce that with kubeadm. But I think it's reasonable to exclude kube system from the host namespace check, because CNI will, all the CNIs that deploy today use daemon sets, which will also use host network namespaces as well. So
yeah, that's a big hole. So I agree. So why don't we follow up with the kube system namespace one? Next one, kubeadm uses TLS bootstrapping, and these settings are now mutually exclusive with manual settings of TLS serve file and TLS private key file.
But my question here is, why is this a security concern?
So I think the CIS benchmark was aiming to check that you are configuring the TLS cert for the kubelet client certificate. But since we now shifted to TLS bootstrapping, you don't actually need to configure that anymore. It's all configured through the component config. Most of the tests are checking explicitly for that configuration setting.
I can see there's actually a ticket already open about fixing this for the next version to allow for TLS bootstrap.
Do you have a link to that we could follow up on?
Yeah.
And generally, things need, like the testing framework of CIS needs to change in a bit to support component config in future versions as we mature that.
Agreed.
I hope someone's taking good notes here. Where are we here? All right, cool. Somebody had the link. Who's taking notes? Is that Lee again?
Yep.
Much appreciated, Lee. Next one, kubelet server certificate rotation. The CIS benchmark requires enabling and configured rotate kubelet server certificate. However, the servlet certificate rotation is not fully implemented in Kubernetes. Kubelets are able to submit certificate signing requests, but at present, there is no automatic signing mechanism. This is because the CSR mechanism does not allow enough information about the host identity to reliably issue certificates. Many operators work around this by using rubber stamp mechanism that automatically allows all CSR requests, introducing more security vulnerabilities. Host identity should be considered as higher concerns and could be solved within projects such as Cluster API solutions. We do not believe that the control should continue to exist until the host identity problem is solved. Right now, kubeadm will produce a self-signed certificates during kubelet bootstrap. This is currently the best option without external cluster orchestration such as Cluster API. And second option is to change scaling methodologies.
I think that second thing about changing scanning methodologies is actually a whole separate thing, which we can come to.
Yeah, I haven't even finished what I was going to say on that when I posted. Yes, it is definitely a different thing. Yeah, so I've seen people do some really bad stuff around passing this check. There's actually open source projects. I think it's literally called Rubber Stamp Operator, and it will just sign all CSRs. And it seems like a bad way to jump through this particular hoop. Yeah, so I mean, I understand why it's there. You want to secure communications between API server and kubelet, but we don't actually have a great mechanism for that.
The only problem with this is that by self-signing the serving certificate for the kubelet is that now we are blocking regular users of the metric server. So we possibly might have to write a troubleshooting guide entry about this and explain how users should do it. I mean, one of the ways is for them to sign the serving certificate with the cluster CA. But to my knowledge, Nadir, you had an alternative proposal. Maybe we can write something in the TS guide, basically.
Yeah, so actually, if you look at Prometheus Operator today, they do have, in their JSON stuff, they do have a thing specifically for kubeadm. So we do self-signing right now. Like, I think we just do it once, and we never do rotations because there isn't the signing mechanism. So that's already in place. I think most of the people who are using metric server have got workarounds in place. They might not be fully documented everywhere. So you're right, maybe we should add that because we've definitely seen some issues with that in customer deployments. But it's more about this requiring the servlet certificate rotation when that feature isn't complete yet.
Yeah, we cannot enable this feature gate. If that is the core of the problem, we cannot do it because of the mechanic, like you explained in the text.
So what's the action item here then?
Possibly ease on the control or remove it until, like Nadir is saying, until the mechanic in Kubernetes is better.
Yeah, I don't personally understand the ins and outs of this well enough to really comment on it, other than to say it would be worth raising a ticket, and we can have the discussion in CIS about what this check should really be.
All right. Does someone want to take that action? I'm guessing, Nadir, you're going to follow up afterwards.
Yeah, I'll sort these all out. Fine.
Issues with CIS Docker benchmark. Many organizations will try to apply the CIS benchmarks for Kubernetes as well as Docker. However, the CIS Docker benchmark is geared around deployments of Docker Swarm and can mislead Kubernetes users into believing their install is not secure. 2.8, enable user namespace support. User namespace support is not yet available in Kubernetes, and other mechanisms such as pod security polys can achieve many of the same benefits. That's a little kind of.
It is a kind of. Sorry, that is a bit hand wavy, but I don't think I've actually documented all the issues. But there is this, like, I don't think it's clear with this CIS Docker benchmark what is where it's supposed to be applicable to, and it requires. There's other things like saying you haven't configured logging to an external service in the Docker daemon, but whereas most Kubernetes users are going to deploy a daemon set to ship logs to an external service. So it makes sense in the context of users of Docker Swarm, but don't make sense in the context of Kubernetes.
So is this just a branding sort of messaging problem? Because this first statement here I don't necessarily know whether or not, this seems like a branding problem. People are using the tool incorrectly.
Yeah, I think so. Maybe we need a subset of the Docker. Like, I think some of the tests in it are reasonable, but not all of them. So we might need some sort of subnet of for each container runtime, maybe. Like, you're using container runtime with Kubernetes. These are the tests which are appropriate in this situation.
That seems reasonable to me. Liz, do you have a comment there?
Yeah, I was just taking a look because I'm less familiar with the Docker benchmark than I am the Kubernetes one. But the good news is it's the same people on the CIS side. So I think I'll take an action here to have a chat with him and the authors of the Docker benchmark and see whether they want to have one option would be to mark the sections that are, to somehow specify things that are not appropriate tests in the Kubernetes environment. And another option might be to actually fork out the benchmark and have a Docker in Kubernetes benchmark or something like that. So I can follow up on that with them.
Yeah, all of these below seem weirdly ambiguous because of the use case of Docker Swarm versus Kubernetes.
I am afraid I have to run, but I hope this is helpful, and thank you very much for the input that you're putting into the CIS benchmark, because it's still a work in progress. But
thanks for coming, Liz. We greatly appreciate it.
Take care. Bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Just while we're here, we can talk about this last one.
Which I haven't completed. So I think there's a couple of things here. So I don't know what I'm saying there. I want to go back to the scanning methodology briefly. So we have this issue with managed also with managed control planes, like how do you know the configuration of the Kubernetes cluster without scraping its configuration files? Just feels like a brittle way to do that. And is there another way we could do this? And it's not really a kubeadm question. It's probably a broader Kubernetes question. Should we have some sort of endpoint on the API set that says these are the feature flags which are enabled on this cluster, and have that as the way that these tools can interrogate the configuration of the cluster instead?
Component config.
Yeah, right. This is so ironic because that's one of the arguments.
All right.
The component config that's exposed by, so there's on the kubelet it already exists, but no others. So like you just do /config c and you get it.
And if I wanted, so are those component configs going to exist as config maps in a namespace that you could check on, or?
No, so like you just scrape so the component can source the config however it likes, but the idea is to expose that current configuration it has, regardless of where it has got it from, at config c /config c endpoint in its HTTP server.
Oh, okay. All right. That sounds good. Okay, I'm fine with that. So I think then once we make that transition, that would be we would want to update the CIS benchmark, like that, where we have these recommended tests to use that endpoint.
Should we have, like, when we talk with or submit the issues with the CIS group, should we basically help to spell out, like, the marketing around this needs to be clear that a lot of this is advisory and there's a bunch of constraints and conditions that apply? Because I think the idea of treating it as gospel can sometimes be antithetical to security, as you pointed out in a couple of the issues, right?
Yeah.
So I think we should try to help the branding and the awareness of the community to make sure that we're doing right by people who are setting up clusters, right?
Yes. And the final thing is, so all of our container, this is not a kubeadm question as well, all of our images run as root right now, like, and these throw up errors in the Docker benchmark as well, like you're running containers as root. So are there any plans to re-engineer these images? Like most of them do not need to run, can be run as a non-root user?
I think we can fix that. I think, especially if we have user namespaces in the future, that makes it a lot easier, because that's the whole idea. You have the idea that you're running as root, and then it gives them access to all the features that they would want. I don't think there's any restrictions for most components. I'm trying to think off the top of my head if I can recall it.
I don't think there is. Not really.
I don't recall. The only thing that requires root is the kubelet that I'm aware of.
Yeah. I mean, we even run pause as root, which is kind of funny. And the other thing is what mechanism could we provide to customize the static pods if you wanted to add like a security context options to it, for example?
So, go ahead.
Leah, who is taking notes, sent a PR to basically partially enable this, but we couldn't get this into this release of Kubernetes. So possibly for the next release, we are going to evaluate what is the best way to customize the static pods and with some of these ways to configure them. I had a quick comment here, more like question. Isn't kubeproxy requiring root as well? It requires kernel modules.
Yes.
You're right.
Yeah,
but you might be able to get away with capabilities as well. So there might be different ways to do what it needs. And in fact, the benchmark requires you to set up the modules prior to proxy being enabled, so you can then remove it. So there's different ways of doing it, I think.
Yeah, but I want to make sure that, like, when we're doing a benchmark, we're doing useful things, right? Like that,
Yeah.
we should enumerate the state space of like CNI and the proxy are a little awkward and weird.
Yeah.
And so one thing we did a long time ago, just that's related to sort of security checking, is we did like an RBAC constraint analysis for running the end-to-end tests. And we found out that, like, in order for you to get an actual sane list of RBAC rules, you pretty much have to enable star. So we want to make sure that, like, in the equivalent world of scanning the cluster, that we want to make sure that we're feeding back good signal that's actionable to users.
Yeah.
That, you know, isn't just like, well, in order to do this, you need to have elevated privileges.
Sounds good.
Are there any other last questions, comments, complaints, concerns on the CIS benchmark?
So the benchmark had a lot of items that basically said that kubeadm is not configuring them, and a lot of those are only possible to configure using extra arcs. Again, I wanted to point out that this is something the benchmark covers, but it's a wider problem with component config again. And I don't think it's useful to even report these things until we have this basically in place in Kubernetes. It's not useful. There's so many items that basically Nadir added like extra arcs. So maybe we should communicate that as well with the CIS folks.
I also don't think we want to configure these as default because they change the behavior of the cluster quite significantly. They're reasonable in high security environments, and we have the extra arcs does provide a mechanism by which to configure them. So I don't see those as specifically issues we need to solve. We just need to make sure that people are able to configure these, and we do.
So I think there's two parts to this story. One part is working with the CIS team to help try and change marketing, branding, awareness, and the tests themselves. I think the second part is a potential document for people who are evaluating kubeadm for the deployments that outlines basically the details that you wrote up inside of your discuss post, maybe after we've gone through a loop back and forth with the CIS team.
Also, are we planning or willing to help out with like tools like kubench itself, like the things that actually are executing these, verifying these tests? Are we gonna like help Aqua or like do our own, or like what are we gonna use to then verify and have a set of best practices, an easy tool to use?
In my opinion, just being like blunt and honest, I don't think it if we're talking about security for deployments, it should be built into the end-to-end test suite as a profile that gets run as part of the default test mechanisms. I don't think this should be external to core Kubernetes if this is the recommendation that we're basically telling people.
Right. So end-to-end tests, in other words.
That would be my recommendation, I think, because if we're trying to espouse this to the community, it becomes weird if the tests are disconnected from the community, right?
Yes, right. I just wanted to clarify that, because I mean, if we do that the end-to-end test way, which is good, then we need to write a lot. Just mentioning that we need to write a lot of tooling to support the use cases we want. But that's totally fine.
Do other folks have thoughts there? Agreement, disagreement?
I mean, if the Aqua team comes to the Kubernetes repo with ideas on how to enable this, I'm sure that there are a lot of people that can help them out. And maybe we can invest people that can contribute to the end-to-end test extension that we're talking about.
I will happily throw John under the bus to help do that work because we already have separate sets of tests that do security analysis.
Yeah, because currently, if they continue the work separately, it's more of a risk for us to invest the time. If they come to the Kubernetes project, I think we can do it.
Any other questions, comments, complaints, concerns?
Collaborating with Aqua would definitely be preferable.
Yeah, I agree.
My only other comment is to have user-facing documentation to make sure that we're updating a place during the onboarding kind of process, like where people first start learning to use kubeadm. They should be able to see notes about the CIS benchmark and about options that they need that are non-default in order to be compliant with them.
Yeah, that was part of my original long diatribe about we should have some document facing after we do a loop back around with the CIS folks to make sure that like we have a canonical source of truth that we recommend. This is the state of the state. These are good. These are bad.
Yes, we can have some entry point paragraphs about this. We just wanted to basically clean the picture first because some of the items are high risk, but they currently are not really high risk.
Yeah, agreed. Are there any other last comments? Good once, twice, 3 times. All right. Lee.
Hi. Can everyone hear me okay?
Nope, we can't hear you at all.
Okay,
Yes,
perfect. So this is a bit of a shift. If you haven't had the ability to get up to date on kind of what's happening in the add-ons sub-project, Justin and I have been working to kind of iron out some details with regard to how add-ons actually get installed. And the goal is to build some shared mechanisms and interfaces that can be vendored into projects like cups and kubeadm so that they can source, add-ons packages from similar locations, not like the same location. And I wanted to just run a few ideas by all of you because some of them, may be a little controversial. Sorry, I'm trying to find the document. So the first bit is that we'd like to keep things as simple as possible. A lot of add-ons just use kubectl to apply things, and kubectl does have the vendor customized support into it now. I'm curious if anyone has any objections to using customize for packaging of add-ons. The benefits being that you get like some more sophisticated support with the customized overlays to do things like templating values, selecting namespaces for which things are installed, standardizing what labels your tool is applying. Your tool can also apply like annotations and things like that. This would allow you to like swap out images on the fly, and then it's patchable, right? So users can specify their own patches. We would be interested in building a component config portion around customization YAML in order to support this kind of packaging effort and make it standardized in the way that installers are loading these packages for installation. So that's the gist of it. Does anybody have any comments or concerns with that?
So you're talking shell out to use customize, or you're talking about incorporating a package which then includes, because the problem that I see currently with customize is import universe?
Yes, there's effort right now in customize to like basically extract everything into PKG. And that's obviously ideal, like if you can vendor things in, then you can test the code paths without like relying on the POSIX interfaces. But as far as simplicity goes, really, like right now, we don't have server-side apply like really ready for all of the things you would need it for. So for me, that's more of an implementation detail. I think it's simpler to just shell out the kubectl and rely on its customized support, but that it doesn't have to be that way. I certainly wouldn't be for trying to re-implement the kubectl apply logic inside of kubeadm.
No. But if we could,
but maybe doing the customized templating inside of kubeadm and then just passing the manifest, I think that would be fine.
Yeah. Fabrizio, do you have thoughts here?
No, I don't have yet figured out the details. For sure, I don't want to import too many things because we are starting also a discussion about moving kubeadmin out of the tray. So
one of the problems is that we have to figure out the packaging situation again. Basically, we already recommend kubectl as an installation package during upgrade in some of the other tutorials. So I don't think it's going to be that much of a problem if we say, hey, you also have to install kustomize if you want to support add-ons from kubeadm. So I think it's okay in general. Yeah.
Isn't like it's already built in.
It's already built into kube control.
Yeah. So we don't need to say anymore, require anymore. It's already, you specify the -k flag in kubectl, and there you go.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that we have to tell people to install kubectl on all the nodes that they want.
Yes, shelling out to kubectl would now create a runtime requirement on kubectl from kubeadm, and I do not believe that is currently a requirement. So
well, when we do the
change.
When we do the installation, we actually say to install kubectl. So
yeah, on the package level, yes, we have something like that. Yeah, I mean, but why would you need to shell out to kubectl just for customized support or just generally for apply support until server-side apply is a thing?
That's the first requirement, yeah, is to just have general apply support with all of the necessary merge semantics, because you're going to need that to do simple upgrades, from the customized package. And then the fact that customize is already vendored into kubectl is just kind of icing on the cake, keeps it very simple. But if we move ever to server-side apply packages, then we're going to need to also vendor in the customized stuff beforehand, or else you'll have to shell out just something. Yeah.
Or we might decide to shell out forever, which also...
I don't have a huge problem with just shelling out forever, but that's my personal opinion, and like everyone has to buy into it. So.
In terms of prototyping and implementation, do you think it's wiser before jumping with PRs to kubeadm and kops to create some sort of a prototype deployer tool where we can experiment with this shell out?
That could be very useful. I like that. It gives us space to figure out the component config bits for what the installation will look like, because basically we need like some kind of customization YAML wrapper. Like we need to be able to provide a list of those things, and then we need a place for users to be able to specify their custom resources. Unless we are like registering the CRDs inside of the installer tool into the scheme, we cannot actually validate those CRs until we put them into the cluster, which maybe a runtime error for those things is fine for a proof of concept. But yeah, there's a lot of kind of API machinery bits in here that need to be proofed, and it's kind of a significant effort. So doing it externally from kubeadm, maybe in the add-on operators repository first, and then having something that we can then like put into a proper home and then vendor in could be good. Because these libraries will ultimately need to be shared. So if we start out externally from the repo anyway, then you'll have the separation you need for it to be used in COPS and kubespray and any cluster API implementation or whatever.
Yeah, I think this is the right thing to do from the start, to have it separate.
I have also a question. Where the mapping between the Kubernetes release and the add-on release will be managed? I make an example.
That's to the second point there, and I really like that you brought that up because it is a little bit of a problem. Right now, since our add-ons are basically hard-coded into kubeadm, they are commit by commit versioned into the binary, which means if you use like kubeadm 111.1 right versus like 111.4, like if there were code changes to the add-ons, they're guaranteed to be like thoroughly tested with that version of kubeadm. When we move to an external packaging solution that's like pulling something in with a ref over the network, you're a lot more similar to the Docker images, right? So like we have to bump our Docker image versions. And I think we calculate those currently based off of the Kubernetes version flag or the introspected version from the kubeadm binary. So I would think that we would do a similar pattern to determine what the proper like upstream packages are for things like core DNS and kubeDNS, or sorry, core DNS and kubeproxy. Are you following me, Fabrizio? Am I being clear?
Yes, I'm just wondering if it might help to draw some diagrams of the interaction between kubeadmin and or COPS and the add-on manager tool.
Okay.
For having a clear understanding of the bootstrap phase where kubeadmin have to create the CRD and the and whatever is necessary for having the add-on manager running. Then we have another workflow that is kubeadmin asking to the add-on manager to install one add-on. And the last workflow is kubeadmin asking to the add-on manager to upgrade one add-on.
Yeah, and then just to kind of refactor wording a little bit is I believe that the add-on manager is implemented likely as libraries that will be vendored into kubeadm. Since the model of tools like kubeadm POPs is that they run with privileges for short periods of time as they mutate the cluster's resources. So likely not a separate microservice that kubeadm is talking and authenticating to, but rather it just being built in directly into it with some small libraries.
By vendoring the so-called add-on manager, and if we decide to keep kubeadm coupled with the Kubernetes release, supposedly we are also going to couple the add-on bundles to a Kubernetes release. Is this correct?
That's what I was getting at with the like.
Yeah, but COPS is going to be
So the groups, however you're defining like your add-on manifest, it's no longer baked into code. Yeah. So you have to pull it in via reference from the Kubernetes version, which that's actually a good thing because but you can use like an older version of kubeadm to like install like newer Kubernetes, and it's weird.
There's a bunch of logistics here that it's just going to take a time to make it clean. Like we should start with something very simple, like core DNS, for example, and work one thing at a time. because there's a bunch of constraints about other UX workflow that exists for air-gapped installs and stuff that we're going to have to make sure that are clean. Right. So the problem is that we have legacy code that we need to make sure that it'll work with all of this.
There's 4 minutes before the cluster API meeting takes over our Zoom, by the way.
This actually should be separate, but.
Yeah, maybe we should start with kubeproxy actually, because core DNS is like a complicated mess. This release.
As far as like what we're installing, it's pretty, tangent to the actual like what's around it. We have some existing work for installing things like core DNS, and the proxy stuff is also a good target. But yes, let's get some proof of concept code. I just really wanted to vet some of these ideas and have people poke them and figure out where they fall apart. So thanks for all of the comments with regard to that. I think I've heard. It sounds like we in general support the approach and don't have too many major roadblocks, and we're going to be able to work through these things. So
yeah, I would highly recommend a KEP for this work for the next cycle. If you want to start to work it in next cycle on 116, like what's your time frame? Okay.
116 is reasonable, I think, for alpha implementation of these component configs, and the libraries being vendored into some feature flag.
Yeah, I think KEP's required for this one.
Yeah, I can do the convincing required to get a KEP.
I just wanted to mention that kubectl is going out of tree and they are decoupling from the Kubernetes version, so it might create a bit of a complication in terms of the shell out calls and stuff. And also, I have a little bit of a popcorn planned in terms of how they're going to manage this queue with the rest of the components. I just wanted to mention that.
I wasn't aware of that. Thank you.
I don't think there are going to be problems with chilling out, because then we're operating on binary level, not staging Go depths level. But yes, for vendoring, I think it just kind of gets cleaner. I hope, at least. I don't know exactly, but please just, we're running out of time here, but please link to the discussion of kubectl moving out.
Okay.
Cool. Yeah, I mean, that's all I had. Thanks for working through those issues with me. I'll get them into the design doc for the add-ons project.
Yep, thanks. And before we close, I just wanted to point out that CNCF has now added kubeadm as a core competency in their CKA exam for next release, which is still nice. On their initiative too.
Right, we are at time, so we're gonna call it. So thanks everybody.
Thank you all.
Yep. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.